This is Montreal Now with Aaron Rand and Natasha Hall. CJAD 800.
All right, that is James MENNIE. He's over at the Montreal Gazette. And Jim, I thought we'd start today with the rumor, if you want to call it that, maybe it's more than that, of a potential early election coming up provincially. What's going on?
Well, this is a great story because this shows how, on the one hand, people can sort of go galloping off in the wrong direction. But even as you're doing that, there's a voice in the back of your head that's saying, well, maybe you're not going in the wrong direction. Yesterday morning, at about 10 o'clock, some reporters began tweeting about how they had received a message from the Coalition Avenir Quebec asking how many spaces they expected to take up on a campaign bus during the election campaign. So, of course, everyone starts ringing the alarm bell and what's going on here. And then finally the CAC, the same day, basically says, well, no, we're just doing, we're planning early, we're just doing logistical checks and whatever. But no one really wants to believe that in the short term. And the reason they don't want to believe that is that we're looking at a situation where you've got a by-election that's coming up in Montreal, the date for which has yet to be set. And given that we know the general election is going to be on October 3rd, people are kind of asking themselves, well, maybe they don't want to, maybe they don't want to have two elections. Maybe they just want to get the whole thing over with in one fell swoop. The other factor as well is that Eric James and his, Conservative Party of Quebec, even though they are not a direct looming threat at the moment, seem to have nowhere to go but up, given the divisions in Quebec and Canadian society, the fact that everybody loves an underdog in media, and Monsieur James can count on a lot more attention than he's been receiving in the past. That could also be a factor because, as we've discussed on this show, his support is not coming from Midtown Montreal. He's not going to take away from the Liberals. If he's going to take away from anybody, it's going to be the CAQ and, to a certain extent, the Parti Québécois. Finally, and this is the icing on the cake, today we discovered this afternoon there's going to be a provincial budget on March 22nd, I believe, avec Gérard. So if you look at all these things together, individually they may seem, harmless enough, but if you look at them all together, you could see the case being made for an early election to avoid letting the Conservatives get more powerful, to also perhaps try and leaven the amount of grumpiness and crankiness that's existing in Quebec society right now, with lots of goodies being shown via a budget. And also, as I've said repeatedly, this is a government that loves to change the channel on things. Remember, we're going to find out more about the bungling of the pandemic here in Quebec. We're going to find out more about the costs, not just in the past, but in the future as well. I think there are a few things that will never go back to normal in Quebec, and we're going to literally pay the price for that down the road. So even though François Legault this afternoon said, no, we're going to stick, it's a fixed election date, we're going to stick with that, the election is going to be in the fall, let's be careful. This is the same guy who pledged in 2018 that the first past the post election that swept him and the CAQ to power was the last time we'd be using that system. We're supposed to be using a proportional representation, two-tiered kind of semi-mutant system, which was supposed to be in effect for this election. This got flushed quicker than Trudeau flushed his promise for electoral reform back in 2015. So I would say on the one hand, it looks as if for the time being that no, we're not going to have an early election. However, there's a lot of things that can happen between now and, say, in the middle of March. Remember, perhaps the mood will improve when the last of the regulations are lifted. Maybe people will be ready to go to the polls a little bit early. But, you can't tell for sure. But what we do know is François Legault is a guy who has never walked away from a gamble, especially when it involves his political future.
I'm thinking as you say this, if you were going to call this strategically, right, you would wait for every COVID restriction to be lifted and then say, kind of, look what we did. Okay, we're to call an election.
Well, and do it quickly enough before things get bad again, right?
Well, the restrictions, the last of them come off on the 15th of March.
Yeah.
Okay. If we're having a budget a week later, You got a bit of a buzz on because you don't have to, do any of this stuff anymore. And what if Mon Oncle Francois gives you a big fat tax cut because you've been so brave and powerful and you kept your chin up through the pandemic? Oh, by the way, you know what? We've gone through so much. We want to have a nice summer. Let's get that election over with sooner rather than later.
Nice. Look at you heading up his campaign, even though you didn't know
Yeah,
it.
it wouldn't be the first time.
Okay. So let's move from that to this other really federal story, even though it involves a former provincial premier, Jean Charest. That drumbeat keeps getting, it seems, louder and louder. Jim, what do you make of this?
Absolutely. And it's, I got to tell you, you're right. It's a federal story, but man, is this ever turning into a story about Quebec? Because today we have 4 MPs, 2 of them from Quebec and 2 others, one from Ontario, one from Nova Scotia. And they're basically begging Jean Charest, who in their open letter, they stopped short of saying could turn water into wine. But man, it's close, right? This is the guy who needs to lead the country. He's got all the qualities. And I heard Tom O'Carroll's analysis saying that, they might not be able to meet in the middle, but I don't think that's the issue anymore. I think what we're seeing, more than maybe an attempt to try and get into the Conservative Party of Canada, or as I like to call them, the Harper Conservatives. But even if his potential candidacy is blocked for a second time, because he tried this once again when they got rid of Andrew Scheer, and the rules were such that he figured he didn't have the time, and you have to have a certain amount of time to sign up members. It's not the caucus that chooses the leader, it's the members. So if Jean Charest and his networks, and the networks of those who support him, could turn around and start signing up thousands of what you can only refer to as instant conservatives, and he even did have a shot. Well, the people in the caucus right now, many of whom don't really think or would like to have Jean Charest anywhere near them, could try and see to it that the rules are once again, put together. I won't say rigged, but simply created to make it virtually impossible for him to even have a shot. At which point, though, when you have people in the caucus from Ontario, certainly from Eastern Canada, saying this is the guy we need, you may end up seeing a split, and I mean a genuine political schism between, what you might refer to as, red Tories, or back in the day, progressive conservatives, or simply politicians, conservative politicians, who would one day like to form the government. And with this particular, and I'll describe it as very toxic political mix that exists within the Conservative Party right now, where they're doubling down on things like the occupation of Ottawa, where they're sounding more and more like a American Republican farm team. You might not find a middle ground. In fact, you'll see a rift, you'll see a split. Maybe it won't be, maybe they'll be guaranteeing Trudeau another term in office. But there may be enough people out there who are of a conservative bent who are saying, we have got to hit the reset button, start from scratch, and try and offer Canadians an alternative that doesn't involve having to listen to Fox News to understand their policies. This is a story I think we should all watch. I think Jean Charest is a character in this story, but there's a larger narrative going on here right now, guys. And I think, as I said, even when the occupation began and everything began going south, I think we're seeing a real divide, not between Canadians, but a real chasm forming between political ideologies in this country. And it's going to be interesting to see which way it's going to go.
Mm-hmm. It will indeed. I just, I think perhaps he's providing the perfect blend of, what's old is new again. That the people are familiar enough with him, and yet he brings different ideology, perhaps. But I just still see it as same old, same old.
Can you get away from that if you're him?
Yeah.
Well, you can't get away from it, but don't forget there have been, how long is the UPAC investigation,
right,
the liberal financing? It's been going on literally for years. The one thing you can absolutely be sure of in Jean Charest's record is that he has won infinitely more elections than he has lost.
That's true.
And right now, that is a big line on the CV of anybody who wants to lead the Conservatives in this country.
Take a wild guess, by the way, that if he does end up heading the Conservative Party, that he won't get Francois Legault's thumbs up in the next election, I guess, huh?
Well, no. But on the other hand, given how much help that was to Aaron O'Toole,
fair enough,
I would suggest he doesn't need it.
Okay. I was just going to add, he also has the charisma and a likability factor that has been sadly lacking in conservative leaders.
Well, he's a good politician.
That too.
No question, yeah. James, thank you. James MENNIE over at the Montreal Gazette.